Welcome to this May edition of Doug Wilson and Friends. Joined here, as always, by Doug Wilson and some friends. Jared Longshore, I'm Joe Rigney. And we've got a good show today. We're going to talk a little bit about the woke right. Is it a thing? Is it even a thing?
Can we even talk about it?
Can we even talk about it? Does it exist? How does it? Who is it? So we're going to talk about that. But the way we're going to get there is actually with some big-ish announcements that we've made this week. So let's start with Christchurch, Babylon.
Yes, Christchurch, Babylon. Lord willing, the creek don't rise. We're going to be planting a church in Washington, D.C. July 13th will be the first worship service. We have a number of people, friends of our ministry and people from Moscow who are now in the D.C. area. And it got to the point where we thought it was a strategic moment for planting a church there for our people, and also because the moment is ripe for jacking up the house of evangelical cultural engagement and pouring a slab under it. Mm-hmm. Our enterprise has been far too instinctive and seat of the pants kind of engagement. And we believe that evangelical cultural engagement requires a solid foundation of exegetical preaching, worship that drives and shapes everything. And so we thought in D.C. we should practice what we preach.
Yeah, and there's an element there of like, so there's if there's two bad ways that evangelicals have done it, there's certain kinds of, and I'll use this term loosely, evangelicals, not even the right word, that are happy to step into the arena and are willing to get into the messiness of politics. And if they get invited to the White House, they'll be there with bells on.
Right.
And that's how you get Paula White running the White House faith office. So there's that kind. And then there's the other kind that wouldn't be caught dead within 100 miles of anything smacking of that, because the gospel is neither right nor left. We don't get political. Right. My kingdom's not of this world. That sort of impulse, which means that a lot of the folks with a foundation won't build anything on it. Right. And then a lot of the folks who have a really rotten foundation are more than happy to build the wrong thing. And so we thought that there was a good moment here, partly driven, like you said, by our own members, people from either our church or churches out here or broader CREC that want a good church in Washington, D.C., want a church that's aligned. Because there are good evangelical churches that that are there and that are doing good work, but that have our theological vision, Reformed, covenantal, and build and fight, and they need a place to go to church. And so this was a good time for them. But then also there's some momentum. So we are doing it a little bit unusual. So first Sunday, man, Jared Longshore, will be delivering the message on what?
Ephesians. The plan is for us all all the ministers that will go to preach through the book of Ephesians. Right. So I can't remember how many verses you have allotted. It's Ephesians 1, verse 1 through something.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how far, but that will be the plan for us.
If we're truly reformed, it's halfway through verse 1.
Yeah, halfway through verse 1.
That's right.
Yeah. So you'll be preaching that week. And this isn't a little bit of an unusual method. So if someone says, you guys are going to plant a church, but you don't have a church planter, you don't have a minister, how's that going to work? Why is that a good way to do it?
If we have read the moment right, that there is a high level of interest in a worship service like what we do in this area, we will run the flag up the flagpole, see how many people salute. If it's what we expect a good response, and we think that congregation would be in the best position to select their permanent pastor.
Right.
Having flying ministers in, which is what we're going to do, flying ministers in is no long-term solution at all.
Right.
So we don't want to do that. But we do think you can prime the pump that way, sufficient to get the congregation formed.
Yeah. I think you said before that the kingdom of God doesn't come like the 101st Airborne, but in this case, it sort of is. So it's a temporary church planting measure.
Right.
and with the idea that if you build it, he will come, meaning he being the minister. And that there's a different kind of skill set. So the way I thought about this is there's the kind of church planting, pioneering skill set is a narrower one than the general pastoral shepherd skill set.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to say to a guy, hey, we need you to go plant a church in Washington, D.C. It's another thing to say to a guy, there's already a church in Washington, D.C. With all of these people who need a shepherd to come administer word and sacrament and care for their souls. And we think there might be more guys and in that category that would be fit for this. But that we kind of realized, I think we all kind of looked around at each other and said, there's a need for this. And we do have a lot of ministerial horsepower here in town, number of ministers in our own churches. And then we had a lot of friends and we thought, man, I think there's something here. Let's see how far down the runway, and the Lord's provided. And so that's that. So if you live in D.C., Northern Virginia, Maryland, we're working with the CREC Church in Annapolis is providing some on-the-ground help and assistance. Some of the members there who actually live closer to D.C. Will be a part of the kind of core group. But if you're interested in that, you can go to Christkirk, and you can choose. You can go to christkirkdc.com, or if you're feeling particularly spicy, you can go to christkirkbabylon.com, and you'll end up in the same spot. Sign up for updates. If you'd like to give to the effort, that's all there. But that's only one of the kind of unusual church planting moves we're making. This one's not as public, but still on the table. You want to mention the other one?
We are going to do something similar at a lower register in Hillsdale, Michigan, at Hillsdale College. Again, some of our people are there.
Yeah.
And Hillsdale is a Judeo-Christian place. They're reconnecting with their Christian foundations, but it's not an explicitly Christian college. I would say it's a college that's friendly to Christianity, and they want to reconnect with their Christian roots. But a lot of the Christian influence at Hillsdale is Roman Catholic, and one of the things that we think is a shame is that intellectuals occupying the public square are frequently Roman Catholic. And in a time when we have a large number of Reformed believers, that's a disgrace. When you look at the centuries, the history of Reformed political thought and engagement and cultural engagement, it's just embarrassing. And so consequently, if your child is going to Hillsdale and you don't want them to become a Roman Catholic, then check out what we're doing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that's going to be more of a kind of house church kind of model initially.
Yeah, starting off as a house church.
House church and see what we can get off the ground there. But a similar thing. So if there's folks connected to Hillsdale, be watching for more information. I assume that you'll post some stuff on that as we get closer to the time. Okay, and then the last thing on this is we have our first incoming class of Grey Friars, new Grey Friars Hall for the fall, signed up, locked in, learning Hebrew right now. And this is kind of an exciting thing because as we try to export whatever it is we're exporting here,
that we'll talk about in a minute.
What are we exporting here? Is it woke? Is it woke, right? This is kind of one of the key mechanisms, right? So we're all very excited about these guys. And as they are taking Hebrew and getting ready to move to Moscow, we're gearing up for classes. We just got our schedule set for the fall. You're teaching...
Covenant Foundations.
What are you going to do in that?
Covenant peanut butter, covenant jelly, covenant potato chips,
covenant coffee beans. I'm very excited about it. I'm still going to be kind of putting final touches on what it's going to look like, but we're basically going to be doing a lot of covenant theology, but not only covenant theology proper, like, Old Covenant, New Covenant, Covenant of Life, Covenant of Grace,
Mosaic, Abrahamic, that kind of stuff.
So we'll cover all of that and then deal with a lot of the debates that are going on around how you're understanding the covenants. But I do believe it's central to your hermeneutic. It's going to be central towards all sorts of pastoral ministry. So what is covenant renewal worship then? What is the covenant family? It'll have all of its various applications. Right. So that should run half of the year. Yeah. So Covenant Foundations, basically term 1 and term 2.
Yep. And then kicking into Cultural Foundations, which is kind of getting out more into Christian nationalism, what are the world we living in, what are we living through, that kind of stuff. Yep. You're doing hermeneutics.
I am.
Which you've done for a long time with the Grey Friars, and this
Right.
is kind of the leveled up academic version of that. And what are you doing in Covenant?
What I'm going to be doing is teaching the students, working through the students, how to read the Bible in a way that is guaranteed to get you into trouble. Just
you've had plenty.
Oh, tell me more. I'm actually now
plenty
okay.
of practice.
I'm interested. I want to enroll. I'll
that's
be
right.
enrolling.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, it's short for I'm doing 2 terms also, Jerusalem term and Nicaea term, and there'll be prolegomena, to use the big word, in the first term. And then in the second term, it'll be an intensive drilling down into looking at how the New Testament handles the Old Testament. Right. So years ago, and this is what first got me in trouble, is I went through my New Testament, highlighted all the Old Testament quotations, and most Bibles have a citation of where in the Old Testament's from, but they don't do the same thing in the Old Testament. They don't tell you in the Old Testament where this is quoted in the New. So I highlighted all those passages. Then I spent a few weeks looking up all those passages in the Old Testament, highlighting them there, and then writing in the margin where in the New Testament that was quoted. So then when I was done, after about a month maybe, I had an apostolic study Bible. So when I was reading through the Old Testament, I come to Psalm 2. Oh, Psalm 2 is quoted in Acts 4. This part is Acts 4. This part is Acts 13. This part is quoted here. And I would look in the New Testament to see what that verse meant. And it was astonishing how rarely it meant what I thought it meant.
Right. Surprise.
And so when I started talking about what the New Testament said the Old Testament meant, presto, trouble.
Trouble in every direction.
And sometimes, you just did this in a sermon, and boy, I had never seen it before. But I'm thinking it's related to this. You call it the Apostolic Study Bible. Don't you use that term sometimes? But you were preaching out of Acts on Peter, and Peter's in Joppa, and Peter, that's where he has the vision of all the dirty animals. He's supposed to go to the Gentiles, but it's like, no, I won't. So you riffed off of that, and then you brought up the fact that Jonah was in Joppa.
Yeah.
So Jonah was in Joppa, not wanting to take the message of salvation.
And Peter is Simon Bar-Jonah. Peter is...
I was like, what? I'm like, double check. I'm going back in the Old Testament to Jonah. I never paid enough attention to see the connections, but that was, I'm sure that kind of is the kind of thing that comes up.
Good. Yeah, and then I've got Old Testament survey, so I'll be teaching that for these guys, and we are excited. So if we get requests. So we're planning these churches in D.C. and looking at Hillsdale. We get requests from time to time from places saying, "Hey, are you ever going to put a CREC church here, there, everywhere?" And I just want to say we're trying. We're working on it. We need to get these guys ready to go. But if you want more interested on Friars Hall, greyfriarshall.com, you can go check that out. If you want to give to that effort, Ezra Scholarship is how we fund it. But the more important thing is woke right. So you wrote today on this because it has been I would say like a persistent conversation, I'd say over the last 6 months or so, is the pivot from woke just means whatever the progressive insanity is.
Right.
From racial to sexual to transgender, all of that, that's wokeness, feminism. But there seems to have been an effort to identify an equivalent ideology on the right and then to use it. So do you think that's legit? Do you think that there is a woke right?
I think there is a tiny group on the right to whom that phrase would fit.
Okay.
But it doesn't fit in the vast majority of cases where it's being applied. Okay. So it seems to me that the squishy moderate or the squishy left evangelical world wants to call woke right any conservative Christian who's fighting.
Right.
If there's any kind of effective fight going on where the enemy is identified and engaged with, then, you're just doing what they're doing. They're shooting at you, you're shooting at, there's a fight going on. And it's way too broad a brush. It doesn't really communicate anything. Is Nick Fuentes woke right? Is Aaron McIntyre woke right?
Yeah.
Is is Candace Owen woke right.
Yeah.
You can
Is Yoram Hazony. So Nick Fuentes, who's I think anti-Semitic, like fairly clearly anti-Semitic. Candace Owens, anti-Semites. They're woke right because it's usually because of the anti-Semitism. And then Yoram Hazony is woke right.
Right. Who's a Jew. and an observant Jew, not a self-loathing Bolshevik Jew, but an observant Jew.
Yeah.
And in the woke right, according to Michael Fallon and James Lindsay, NatCon, National Conservatism, is sort of the granddaddy operation overseeing all the woke right stuff. And I would say as a label, it's just incoherent. Mm-hmm. But there are people, and I would say basically the black-pilled Nietzscheans, the people who've just written everything off, and women, the people who like Andrew Tate. Mm-hmm. This will offend feminists. This will offend the classical liberal order. That kind of thing. I would say, that's woke right. They're just flipping identity politics on its head. Mm-hmm. Which identity politics is. The fundamental antithesis is oppressor, oppressed. And for biblical thinkers, it's righteousness and unrighteousness, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. So if you say, actually, white people are the oppressed class.
Universally and all the time.
And you're a relativist and there is no God. It's fair game to call that woke right. Mm-hmm. That's one group. Then there are people on the right who are so far done with caring what liberals think that they go out of their way to tweak them and use offensive language that opens them up to the charge of being woke right.
So just this is the transgressive right that's always anything that would offend a liberal is the thing that we have to say right now.
Have to do right. And they are and knowing them and knowing their background, they believe in God. They believe there is such a thing as sin. They believe that people on their side could be sinners and someone on the other side could be right with God. They're not absolute relativists. They're not Alinskyites of the right. But they sometimes talk like they're Alinskyites.
Yeah.
And they are susceptible to the charge. So I think the charge is inaccurate but understandable in their case.
Yeah.
I wonder if this came out in one of my NSA lectures. At some point, we were talking about the WASP establishment. We were doing negative world, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hegemony. And in that, I said, it doesn't need to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant hegemony in my book, but there's always a hegemony, and we just need to lean into it. So I was like, build the hegemony, and they just love that, right? So immediately the memes were flying about making hegemony great again. And I took them on this whole story about how I still remember all the way back to the social justice statement, like when that whole thing broke in American evangelicalism, and it was like we were dealing with intersectionality, we were dealing with real wokeness, and of course in the intersectional scheme you had the white, the male, the native born, the able-bodied, and that's your hegemony. And I remember thinking, well, actually, there's always going to be a hegemony.
Not whether but which.
It's not whether but which. But
because at that point, like the word hegemony just means like a dominant culture.
Yes.
And it's like that's unavoidable.
That's setting the parameters, setting the temperature for how we act in here and what's accepted, what's not, and that's always going to be the case.
Whose house is this?
Right.
But the weirdest thing to me was like I remember seeing conservative evangelicals on kind of individualist assumptions on like everybody, freedom of speech, like we can speak at the mic and you can speak at the mic and there was a conservative impulse to actually reject wokeness on the basis that there is no hierarchy, on the basis that there is no group identity, on the basis that there is no hegemony. And I remember thinking, this isn't good. Like we're in that group actually did a lot to defeat wokeness in evangelical circles. They're all conservative thinkers, people, but they don't understand that there really is a hegemony. And
Well, it seems like, so back to something you said about, it's just a term of derision. And it seems like the minute that a term like racist cease to be an effective steering label for conservatives, right? So you mentioned this, I think, in your post, that a conservative is racist is someone who's winning an argument with a liberal.
Yeah.
And when all of a sudden that just stopped sticking,
it doesn't work
because everybody was, we're all racist. Everybody's racist. Yeah, we know. Who cares? And they moved on. It was all of a sudden. It's an interesting thing to like go. It's the way that certain groups identify what label is toxic to normies.
Yeah.
And can we take that label, the label that's toxic to normies, and if we can slap it on threats, then the normies will run, and they won't rally. They won't coalesce into something substantive if we can label it with whatever the label is that they don't like. And when racist stopped working, why did racist stop working? Because normies wised up to woke. They saw the woke play being run, and so then wokeness became for them anything. This was Rufo's strategy, was to make critical race theory a byword, and anything, all the bad things that were coming out. There it is again, woke, and then all of a sudden now, to have it spun around so that anybody effectively fighting, anybody that has a substantive difference from, this is to your point, like individualism, classical liberalism detached from its Christian foundations. Like anybody who's operating from that is going to use that term because it's illiberal. It's the illiberal right.
Yeah.
That's usually.
And they're saying they wanted to privilege black voices, and you want to privilege Christian voices.
Yeah.
And I would just go, yeah.
Does
that mean if I'm a woke, that means I'm woke? All right, I guess I'm woke.
Yeah. It's just a simple jujitsu move. They're just trying to use the energy that the right successfully generated against critical theory, against woke, against DEI. That was a remarkable victory.
Yeah.
And what they're trying to do is roll with it and flip it back, if possible, on us.
Yeah. So when it comes to like using the term, so some people are arguing like, look, if you borrow concepts from critical theory, then you're woke. And so you brought up kind of social justice statement, the resolutions at the SBC that were basically like, it's an analytical tool. We can borrow the concepts, right? That was kind of like a big deal. There are guys on the right who agree with that and say like, yeah, these critical theorists have, they weren't dummies. They do have things that are useful. If someone is doing that, if someone's borrowing concepts from critical theorists, Frankfurt School or whoever, but they're using it now not in a left-wing way, but in a right-wing way. Does that make them woke?
Well, I would say if it really is a neutral technique, right, just an analytic tool, then we could apply it to the white refugees from South Africa.
Right.
Right. And everybody who said it's just a tool should applaud.
Right.
Right. But they won't.
Right.
They simply won't applaud, which means that James Lindsay's got a point when he says there are way more cooties on this thing than you think.
Yeah.
Right. Now, but you have to be careful, because if you say, well, adopting the rhetoric or tactics of the left, well, the left, they have websites, they have conferences. Is that a tactic?
They organize. They send emails saying, let's show up and protest things.
They have buses.
Yeah.
Those are all tactics. And so when you read through Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, he's got a bunch of rules. Make your adversary live up to his own rules. Right. Well, there's nothing dirty about that.
Right.
And it's a shrewd tactical thing to do. Okay?
Right.
Alinsky also says that humor is a weapon that is almost impossible to defend against. Right? That's right, too. That's correct, too. And there's nothing dirty about it.
Yeah.
But there are other rules that Alinsky has. Being an atheist and an unbeliever, he's willing to hit below the belt. He's willing to lie, for example, and Christians can't do that.
Right.
So I don't have any problem taking tools from the Egyptians, roughly a third of them, right,
yeah,
and checking them over carefully and chucking the rest of them. So if you're using tools that are common to humanity,
right,
organizing your faction, garnering support. That's a tool. They do it, we do it. Everything's fine. Everything's fine.
Right. Yeah, and because this is one of the things that back during the fight over woke, 2019 to 2022 or whatever, One of the criticisms that certain conservative Christians found to be effective was if they could show that critical theory, critical race theory, all this woke stuff had its origins in something bad, cultural Marxists. If they simply by showing the origin of the belief, they thereby discredited it and won the argument. Because as soon as you could say, hey, that idea that this professor at some Christian university is purveying came from the Frankfurt School, that was an effective way to get a bunch of people to go, oh no, and shut it down. And I just remember thinking, I was teaching great books at Bethlehem at the time and going, this is what I do for a living. Like my entire living is going and reading books by people that I don't agree with on, basic worldview questions.
Sure.
But trying to glean is plunder the Egyptians. It's take things and reappropriate it. And
Plato,
Aristotle.
Yeah.
And it seemed like that's not the reason to reject woke is not because some critical theorists came up with it in the Frankfurt School. The reason to reject what was woke at that time was because it was false.
Right.
Like it was they were just wrong. It was out of accord with the scriptures. It was out of accord with reality. It used statistics to lie. It did all kinds of things like that. And it was like, all of that's why we should reject it, and not necessarily its origins.
Yeah.
There's a couple things, you've opened up a can of worms. I think YouTube's going to be lit. I think it's going to be lit on this, and I'm kind of excited to see how it shakes out, particularly because I'm thinking, I was on the floor of the Southern Baptist Convention when the Resolution 9 thing hit, and it was a big deal. And there's at least two things that came to mind as you were talking. One was, I believe what the resolution was to use critical race theory and intersectionality as an analytical tool, which is different than saying, hey, we'll study it and learn things by seeing what they said.
Yeah.
Like, no, they were really take intersectionality, put them on and just analyze. And you're like, no. Right. Yeah. This is a really bad idea. And then it was kind of like, so they were trying to use it as an interpretive grid, and we're like, negative, hard negative. Now read them and find out where they're dirtbags. Right. And then, if you, for the first time in your life, if you actually read a little about intersectionality and you thought about the existence of a hegemony, well, that's true. Like there is a hegemony. Right. Now they're wrong about what constitutes hegemony and then victimhood and all of that other stuff. So I would just throw that in the hopper. It's probably what James Lindsay's saying when he's saying it's got cooties. I don't know. Don't know what he said or not. Yeah. But my assumption is what I know we really worked on was, hey, you're trying to take them and then claim that you can just use them to survey the terrain. You know what I mean? But no, they're faulty. The very system that you're adopting is faulty. That's at least one thing that was going on.
Well, and I think Lindsay is clearly trying to use it as a to box out conservative, right-wing Christians and resistance to. He wants an atheist paradise that's impossible. And so anything that would upset that apple cart, he's going to just throw this label in that way. But someone like Neil Shinvey has made this kind of his thing now, because he was, I think, an early critic of critical theory and its appropriation, did a lot of work on it.
He did good stuff.
Did some good stuff. And so now he's the one who's a big one saying, hey, the same things that I saw there, I'm seeing here with the woke right. And he points to things like, if you identify that there is a hegemony that operates sort of in the background that most people are unaware of, but then you get the language of red pill. All of a sudden, you wake up to you have been living in the Matrix, you've been living under the Longhouse, the gynocracy, or you've been living under with blinders on. And he says, look, that's the language of woke. You woke up to the world you were living in isn't the real world. That sort of thing. And he says, so he identifies this kind of formal similarity and says, therefore, these are equivalent. So do you think is that a valid way to argue, or does that because I have a strong reaction. I think that's dumb.
It's an inadequate way to argue.
Okay.
That might be right, for example.
Okay.
So I'd go back to Jared's point about hegemony being inescapable.
Yeah.
Okay. So a critical theorist, once he's identified the hegemon, those are the bad guys.
Right.
Right, but just by definition.
Right.
So the hegemon, they're the oppressors, and then anybody underneath them is the victim, the downtrodden.
Right.
We have to stand up for these guys, and we have to oppose the man. We have to oppose the. But if hegemony is inescapable for a Christian, we might say identify the hegemony and say, and good job on that.
Yeah,
way to go.
Thank you, Lord,
Thank you, Lord, for a wise prince
for the hegemony of Christendom.
and we have an educated aristocracy that fears God and that keeps the peasants in line, and we are very
Thankful.
And for this, Almighty God, we give you thanks.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if someone, and I do see the impulse on the right, as soon as they've identified the cabal that's running everything,
Right.
If your first reflex is, and it's wicked,
Yeah.
then, okay, you're at the very least susceptible to wokeness.
Okay.
All right? But if you think, no, it's there are people who run the world,
Right.
and they're not me, and in times of stability and calm, they're doing what they ought to do. They're doing what God calls them to do, to maintain order and peace. And we're instructed to pray for kings and all those in authority,
Yeah.
so that we might live quiet and peaceable lives. What we're doing is praying for the hegemon.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other element would be something like, so this is where, again, Shinvi, I think, is going to point at something like, Kendi and the race guys, the Black Lives Matter, said, we live in a white hegemony that's oppressive to minorities. And then someone like Jeremy Carl writes a book on the unprotected class and anti-white racism that sort of is all through the system, right? Jeremy's book is, and we had him, we had him, right? Yeah. So all through the system is all of these really concrete ways that whites have been disadvantaged by corruption and perversion of the civil rights,
Right.
System. And Shinvi looks at that and goes, see, it's the same. And I go, well, no, one of them's true.
Yeah.
And one of them's not. One of them was made up. One of them was microaggressions, and that sort of thing was what evidence was there for this oppression was microaggressions, right? Mm-hmm. Evidence the other way is policy, concrete policies by universities to say it doesn't matter. We don't want this. We don't want white folks. We want, right. And so it's like the concrete policies is the sort of thing that someone like Carl is pointing out over against these kind of invisible microaggressions.
Right.
Yeah, the microaggressions thing. I mean, it's amazing that had the legs it did, with the very title being like microaggression. You know what I mean? Like, it's just everything about it.
Which we needed to respond with, I micro care.
I micro care. I mean, that got real legs. And I remember, I still remember seeing certain seminaries and celebrating like black enrollment being up, and then you're like, man, like the fact that they had so pasted this to people's skin color, you know what I mean? You're thinking like, you're really going to celebrate these kinds of things. And
the other thing to keep in mind, and this is just, I don't want to come across like I'm on the other handing, so for example, the Supreme Court decision in Loving that struck down Virginia's anti-miscegenation law was, I think, 1962. Okay, 1962. I was a little boy. If it was 62, I was a little boy right next door in Maryland, 9 years old, when the state right next to me was prohibiting a white man from marrying a black woman, or vice versa, and it finally wound its way up to the Supreme Court. So there were the grayheads in the black community can remember remember the days when you had to plan your family vacation carefully on the basis of which hotels would take you and which hotels wouldn't. But it was really striking to me that so first, that was not an ephemeral thing. That was a thing. Yeah. And I'm spacing on the name. Brian Luritz.
Brian Crawford's the dad.
Crawford Luritz
is the dad.
Crawford is the dad.
Brian
is the son. And I remember Crawford speaking in Minneapolis when I was there one time, and he was talking about those days. And there was not an ounce of bitterness in it. It was seasoned, wise,
Right.
Christian.
Clear-headed on this was bad, but not.
Yeah. It was. His talk was magnificent, and he was there, right? And his son is just a seething tangle of resentments over things that never happened to him.
Yeah.
Right? And I'd be willing to bet good money that I couldn't get into whatever country club Brian belongs to. Right? It's like people have short memories.
Yeah.
And we are. I believe that C.S. Lewis meant to represent the Duffelpuds as the human race, and I think that we are very much like that, where we're all doing this stupid thing, and then 20 years later we're doing this other stupid thing, having completely forgotten what we were doing before. And so, consequently, what we need is biblical law. We need a light in a dark place. We need to say, okay, I don't understand human history. I don't understand the socioeconomic history of the United States. I don't understand all the different classes and everything. But God has given us a book.
Yeah. So say you're using the book, right, to filter, to do some of this stuff, because one of the other things that I've seen guys do is say, well, look, if you're getting your ideas, your concepts from questionable sources. So I have friends who see any reference to Sam Francis,
right?
Who popularized the concept of anarcho-tyranny, the idea that the government oscillates between, they allow certain groups to run wild.
Right.
As a pretext for passing more laws, which they will not use on the group that's running wild, but will use on law-abiding citizens to keep them in check. Just this kind of seesaw thing.
Shoot a burglar in Great Britain and find out what happens to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or watching what happened during the George Floyd riots, where who got two-tier justice, depending on whether you're a part of the right group. And so Francis popularized this concept and did so in a way that had racial relevance, right? And I look at that. I remember reading about it and thought, oh, that was just really. I lived in Minneapolis through this, and I just remember that made sense. But I have friends who say because that's tainted at the source,
right?
And I don't even know fully. I've never read a Sam Francis book in my life. I read that essay, but I never read a book. I have no idea. But it's just the fact that I were to quote that or mention that is a sign of compromise, right? You're woke right because it came from there, or various other kinds of concepts that are like that you borrow from dissident thinkers. Means you're woke right and you're playing with fire and it's all dangerous.
Okay. I'd say. Great, I'll bite. Now do the post-war consensus. Okay. Now so if one source is contaminated, why is that a particularly toxic contamination?
Right.
And the official secular agnosticism and atheism that has killed hundreds of millions of people,
right?
Not toxic.
Yeah.
But, I would just say equal weights and measures, and be judicious. So I've read Sam Francis, but it's because I subscribed to Chronicles magazine for a number of years, and I've not read any of his books, but I've read him, and I could see quoting him or learning something from him, and have somebody go nuts when I had no idea about this.
Whatever
this other thing was, just. No idea about it. Mm-hmm. Another thing is this is one of the reasons why things get masked or covered over. So Francis Schaeffer learned an enormous amount from Rushdoony, okay? And it doesn't come out in the footnotes, right? So Francis Schaeffer, what he did is he cleaned Rushdoony up, made him ready for prime time, and Francis Schaeffer is, so if I've made a point of, if I learn something from Rushdoony, I say his name.
Yeah.
I say, as Rushdoony said, inescapable concept. Well, Schaeffer didn't do that. He just sort of
borrowed the idea,
took the idea and made it palatable to the mainstream and did an enormous amount of good. But we're all Rushdoonyites now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Because the whole evangelical world, Francis Schaeffer was the one who brought evangelicals around to being pro-life at all, right? He was the one who did that, and he did it by softening the edges, sandpapering the whole thing, and leaving Rushdoony out of the footnotes, right? So would the people who would cancel Rushdoony, it's tainted at the source, man, would they cancel Schaeffer? Well, they will 30 years from now, but not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah. Right now, they're still building memorials to him, naming, remember the lecture, the prize that was taken away from Tim Keller at Princeton?
Yes.
It came out that somebody discovered, I don't know how they discovered it, but they discovered that he was opposed to homosexual marriage.
That's right.
They had some sleuths on the case. And the prize that Princeton took away from Keller for opposing gay marriage was the Kuiper Prize.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So basically, I think grown-ups should be able to read a book and learn from it. Chesterton's my favorite papist. On Calvinism, he's just silly. He's just silly, but I still love him.
Yeah.
Right. And I can learn from Rushdoony. I can learn from North. I can learn from Sam Francis. Why can't I be a grown-up and read a book?
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to broaden the point to this. The overall question is an interesting one about woke right, because you're trying to read the signs of the times, and you have Trump and you had Doge. If I were just going to try to counsel like our college students, I would say I don't think you have much to worry about with any kind of significant woke right that's going to be anything like what we just experienced with real wokeness. I mean, it was a real problem. It was in churches. We had Anglo 8s and African American 7s. We had it was a significant deal. Are you going to have envy? Yes. Are you going to have people being selfish? Yes. Are you going to have people abusing power? Yes. You're always, that's what.
You may run into people who adopt a victim mindset. In other words, who read Jeremy Carl's book and say, man, this explains so much,
Absolutely.
And this is why, and sink into the victimhood.
Yes. But thinking pastorally, big picture, that's a very small thing. We're experiencing, I think you still have a bunch of conservatives in America that still have a good measure of their Christianity, that don't approve of everything that Trump has done or everything that Elon's done in his personal private life, in his personal life, but are very pleased with the scenario that we're in, that aren't actually riddled with bitterness, that still do need someone to lead them. That I think that's the main setup, and we should just kind of almost laugh off a lot of this. Oh no, woke right's a problem.
So I have a question. So hegemony is an inescapable concept,
Right.
Which I think is right. So that means that there can be good and bad versions of it. There can be legitimate and then misuses. Same thing true of identity politics. Because it seems to me that that's another one that people will use. You're doing identity politics, because it seems to me that sort of tribalism is another kind of inescapable concept. There's going to be people that are your people, and then people that aren't your people. It doesn't mean you have to fight with them, but it's just where your loyalties and allegiances lie.
Right.
If you lean into that and say these are my people, however defined, that somebody's going to say, that's just identity politics, that's woke right.
Put identity politics in a stainless steel bowl and mix it in with the Ordo Amoris.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So, I'm a family man.
Yeah.
I'm a churchman. I belong to a particular tribe.
Yeah.
All that's true. And all knowledge is situated knowledge. My outlook is shaped by the generation I grew up in, right. The place I grew up in.
Boomer.
Boomer. Well, I don't like to brag. All knowledge we're finite. All knowledge is situated knowledge. And all knowledge is relational knowledge, which is, again, I'd return to the earlier point, which is why all of us need a book that comes from outside the world, revelation from outside the world, to keep us grounded so that the identities that I have does not become an idol. Mm-hmm. So when my tribe or my family or my marriage or my vocation becomes the most important thing to me, and God is second or third, then that is idolatry. But I want to distinguish that from what Big Eva used to do. Idolatry is when you like anything.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You like buttered popcorn.
Watch out for your idol.
Watch out for your idols. But there really is idolatry of money, and Schlossberg's book, Idols for Destruction, remains a magnificent book. And so we want to say, identity idolatry is bad. It's not the ultimate grid. It's not the ultimate template. Where if I looked at the whole world through the grid of my whiteness, or the whole world through the grid of my Scottish descent, then that's a problem. That's a problem, and I'm going to be in constant conflicts with members of other tribes. But if I'm a Christian, that means that I can understand that I have more in common with a Nigerian Christian than I do with an atheist who lives next door to me, who shares my heritage, right?
Yeah. More. When you say more in common, you mean you have more, like there's a spiritual bond there that transcends any of the earthly earthly tribal stuff.
Right. It transcends in importance. It might not transcend in practical matters. So I might work together with the atheist at the same company, and we could build a skyscraper together, despite his unbelief.
Yeah.
If I were
and do it more efficiently than if you were trying to do it with
the Nigerian. I couldn't build a birdhouse with him because we couldn't communicate.
Yeah.
But I can easily envision a scenario where I would hide that man. Let's say he's here on a visa. Hide that man from my government. Because they were chasing him because of his faith in Christ. Right. So by faith, Rahab betrayed her people.
Right.
By faith, Jeremiah undermined the war effort. By faith, Gideon conquered armies.
Yeah.
By you can shut the mouth of lions. You can be sawn in two.
Yeah.
Faith goes in different directions depending on the situation.
Right.
So my loyalty to Christ trumps my loyalty to my country at those places where I have to choose.
Yeah.
So
So one side that your identity politics or your tribalism would be going, would get sideways, is that if you did read the story of Rahab and you thought she was the bad guy.
Right.
Right. Like, in other words, if you read that story and said, well, she just betrayed her people.
She did.
This is horrible, that she would do this. That's a sign of your ordo amoris is broken.
Right.
Because you've put an earthly thing, tribe, above God, the living God.
Above the cause of God, and where's the Spirit of God?
Yeah.
Where's the Spirit of God moving? And I need to be there. So I was just thinking about this the other day when that awful story in the book of Judges where the man's concubine was raped and died, and he cut her up in pieces, and then all the tribes of Israel went to war with Benjamin. There were men in Benjamin who never would have done that awful thing. Right. There were thousands of men there, great warriors. There were men who never would have done the awful thing that was done to the concubine, but they went to war over it.
Right.
Basically, there should have been some judicious heads that said, our guys screwed up.
Yeah.
Our guys did an evil thing.
Right.
We need to turn them over.
Right.
But tribal loyalty, so I think Benjamin fought not because they had an allegiance to raping concubines, but because they had an allegiance to Benjamin.
Right.
Rather than to
that trumped allegiance to God and to
correct
his law and his word.
So their sin was not a sexual one, but it was a tribal identity one.
Yeah. So then when it comes to like bringing it down to like the practical, since this is in the news this week and you mentioned it a second ago, the 59 white Afrikaners have been admitted as refugees. And there are some people who want to point out the ideological or some kind of inconsistency because the same groups that have been largely, opposed to the left's open borders, the left's misuse and abuse of the refugee system to transport thousands of Haitians to Ohio. So there's right-wing guys who have been this is the main animating issue that they see. If we don't have a border, if we can't deal with this immigration problem, we don't have a country anymore. And so they're on and on about they all have to go back. Here's 59 Afrikaners that the Trump administration and those same folks are celebrating it. This is absolutely fine. Do you think that's inconsistent?
It is inconsistent if they've been saying send them all back, absolutely all of them back. But if your objection has been the border is out of control, not that people come across it. We're a country of what, 330 million people, probably north of that now.
Yeah.
59 people is a drop in the bucket, and 59 Muslims would be a drop in the bucket. The problem is caused by the volume. So if we admitted people from other countries in onesie twosies, then assimilation's not a problem. You're not going to have Dearborn, Michigan becoming a Muslim town, or that place in Texas with the big Hindu statue. That sort of thing is going to be impossible. So I've always been in favor of low and controlled immigration, that the 59 Afrikaners fit into.
I find that this is the interesting thing. It's particularly on social media with all of the yelling that's always like really immature, and then often framing it. So like I can hear the people go, "Oh, you're being inconsistent," and yet I think most leaders that are going to actually stay in their leadership positions are like, it's not about their skin color. It's just about whether they actually need protection or not. It's just so. I find that it's very interesting. Like, is there some crazy redneck somewhere that is a racist that's being inconsistent? I bet there is. I bet there's people on either side. You know what I mean? But it's like when you just kind of come like, but we have the right to protect some people if we want to.
Yeah, and I think the celebration of it too is also owing to the fact that the left did sort of reveal their hand in it. So when the Episcopal Church says we're not participating in refugee resettlement anymore because you just brought these 59 guys in, and that was a bridge too far for us. Right. So some of the celebration is less about those 59 people in particular and more about what it reveals about the left's game. That Trump found yet again another way to get them to admit out loud.
I don't know how he does it.
Yeah.
Every day, it's like he puts another little bit of catnip out, and every day the cats go crazy. And he did it with the luxury airliner with Qatar. Everybody's yelling about the airliner from Qatar, and he flies to Qatar and signs a deal to sell 160 planes to Qatar, and everybody with the whole world looking at,
right. Yeah.
I think his thing is like when it comes to there's real racism in the world, but it never wins, and there's a real hegemony. And if you're going to base your hegemony on straight up like race, skin color, whatever you want to call it, it's not going to win. The thing that's unique about I do think Trump, if he says their hegemony, I think he knows that. And what is the hegemony? I think he's going to be for competency. Like it really is going to be, are you competent? Like if you're competent for the job, then I think he's going to get behind it and he's going to do it, which is really refreshing. Like that's a wonderful natural principle in the world that would protect you from all of the nonsense that's going on.
Let me throw one other thing in here, and that is one of the charges in this woke thing is there have been attempts by some of the crazies online to reduce ethnicity to skin tone, right? That why can't you stand up for the white race or white that kind of thing? And I think that the reason is on ethnic issues, I'm too American, because I honestly palpably feel that American is an ethnicity. Just recently, I've had the privilege of visiting with different black businessmen, and was struck by how thoroughly American they were. Just they were very much in my tribe.
Yeah, these are my people.
Right, these are my people, and it was so the people who want to sort of create a white enclave, like white ethno-nationalism, are wanting to deny what it means to be an American, right? Okay, so do I believe, and this goes back to the inescapable concept again, do I want an ethno-state? Well, I would say every stable state is an ethno-state.
Right.
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 You can't have a stable state without some principle of cohesion, language, culture, expectations, cuisine, religion, borders. There's got to be some sort of stability there, which means that every state is an ethnic state. Japan is one kind of ethnic state, and Finland was the same kind of ethno state. But large empires like the Roman Empire had people with loyalties to it. Paul was proud of his Roman citizenship. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. He was proud of his city. He was proud of his Roman citizenship. And America is a sprawling, great nation that encompasses the Navajo, who would be a distinct ethnic tribe. But the American tribe includes the Navajo, it includes the blacks, it includes the Scots-Irish, it includes all of them. And if you put them together in a society that's been relatively stable for centuries, a distinct ethnic type is going to emerge.
Right.
And I have a deep affection for that. And I don't want people to break it up into 100 little pieces.
Right. And then there's a certain type of person who leans in because that is back to the beginning thing, the transgressive impulse, which is when there is a certain type of person that is drawn to whatever the transgressive idea of the moment is. And so if you move, which means if you move your Overton, they're going to keep moving out of it to try to, move it over. And so we've, in the backlash against woke, to have fought that off and to make it a byword means that now we've got to find a new thing that will get all the church ladies upset or all the respectables upset. And so if white ethno-state does it, then I'm going to lean in there. But the other thing that maybe there's two comments to end. One thing that you put in your article today that I thought was a really helpful thing is that in an ethnic conflict, the other side chooses your side for you. You don't have to you don't have to do anything in terms of racial pride or racial hatred at all when you're the target.
Right.
And I think that that's one of the phenomenon that I would say for those that think of themselves as more moderate, that are trying to avoid the errors on this side and that side, recognize that when the left makes whiteness an issue, that you kind of just have to budget for that. Like you have to live in the world in which they've made that the thing. And you can try to say, but don't take pride in it, everybody. Let's not do it. And that may all be all to the good, but to ignore it or deny it or to recognize that people will begin to operate accordingly is again a kind of like it's an inescapable concept in like just how conflicts work out.
And a moderate evangelical who's been Doug, don't do that. If the angry mob is coming toward us, he's just as white as I am.
Yeah, right. That's so true. Yeah.
Have you seen the meme of the gal giving CPR and the person that's receiving CPR, it says racism and it says the lefts, and they're like, "Don't die on me." Have you seen that? Yeah. I do feel like that's the moment. Like if someone is going to chunk out kind of woke right and try to kind of resuscitate racism, I don't think it's going to work. I think people are over it. Even like my grandmother from Florida would be like, "This is silly nonsense. Like this is not a widespread problem." So there you go.
Good. Well, this is good. This is a good conversation. I'm sure we'll keep having more. Until next time, this has been Doug Wilson and friends.